Hi and welcome to the first lesson of this module. It's the first but very important lesson because it will help us understand why it's important to having this API gateway component in our systems. So sneak peek, it's not always necessary, but in our context of a public website, public service, it's the must-have. So API gateway is a great example of where data engineering crosses the path of software engineering, because mostly software engineers are responsible for all kinds of APIs and generally backend services in different organizations. And it's here where you will probably work a lot with Java or maybe Python or PHP or Node.js developers. Why? Let me explain. That's the case of a very basic streaming data ingestion. So we can see that we have some real-time data producer writing the data to a streaming broker, to a streaming storage, and after, since streaming can be distributed and read by many different jobs, we have these different jobs in our data system. So the data producer here is separated from our data system and it's considered as an external actor. And what specifically this external actor can be? So in our case, and it may be very common nowadays with the web services, web applications, mobile applications. So here it's a mobile /web application. So we can already see the difficulty for us, I think, because when you have some mobile application writing directly to a streaming broker, how do you do the migration? For example, you may decide that the streaming broker technology doesn't fit your requirements anymore. It's maybe too slow, too expensive, or not scalable. And how do we achieve this migration? With web services, it's relatively easy because you can integrate this upgrade in the code, which is always fresh for the web clients, but it's much harder for the web applications, for mobile applications, because the user generally has to upgrade it before using the service, and it's not always possible to do. It's not always possible to force the user to update this application, and it's maybe not also a good image of you or company. And imagine even other situations, like for example authentication mechanism or some other quick fixes, maybe role management, stuff like that. Having all these important shared things implemented separately on web application and on the mobile application may be very challenging and also not very scalable, because you will repeat the work 2 times. So that's the reason why we very often add an intermediary component between this external world and our data system, and this intermediate component is called API gateway. So when to use what? For the direct data ingestion, we mostly using streaming broker library in Java, in any language you are working on. Whereas when for API gateway is mostly a network protocol, so we will use, for example, HTTP or HTTPS connection. For the flexibility, you already see the picture. Direct ingestion is not that flexible because you always need to force your clients to update their code, their version, in order to use, for example, new features or maybe even change the topology of your streaming broker. On the other hand, API gateway is a kind of proxy that you can manipulate very much more easier than the direct ingestion mode. So you don't force your users to do any work. You generally focus this part in your internal system. Of course, I'm talking here about technical fixes related to the data system. If there are some fixes necessary to be implemented and to be updated on the application, like for example security fixes or other things, yeah, that's legit, but it's not the point of this lesson. For the complexity, on the other hand, while direct ingestion, it should be relatively easy because it's just calling the API with correct authentication. For example, on the other hand, it's a little bit much harder for API gateway because you have to not only add this part on your data producers, but you also need to add this the code for the API gateway that will be responsible for managing authentication, authorization, retries, back pressure, and other important things for an API. And finally, the complexity, so the evolution. It's very hard to evolve direct ingestion, as you know already, and it's relatively easy for API gateway because even if you have to release a whole new major version, you can simply version the API gateway so that old clients call the old version and your new one call a new one. It's just an example, of course. There are also some other changes you can make directly, and it should be generally much more flexible and much more easier to evolve than the direct ingestion. So what are the use cases? For API gateways perform best where there are a lot of heterogeneous producers that you cannot control. For example, our mobile applications, you cannot say each user of your system to upgrade their application at the same time, so at the same day roughly, to use all the new features and to not introduce any regressions, like for example missing data in your system, because you can imagine that a user decides to not upgrade their application today. He decides or she decides to use a previous version that doesn't work that well with previous streaming broker, and maybe it completely survives also the maintenance and the whole architecture on your system, because you have to manage the flow for both versions, for the new and for the old one, so that it can be very complicated. But on the other hand, if you are in a much more much more internal context, for example, inside your company, you have a team that produces some data and you want this team to deliver this data to you, yeah, it's completely fine to do it with direct ingestion without exposing this API, because possibly if the exchange is happens internally to your network, you may just set up some login password or other sample form of authentication. You don't need to worry about other more complex aspects. And of course, if that scenario you need to upgrade something, you can always synchronize with this team, and it should be much more easier than doing the synchronization with a lot of clients worldwide. So that was for the first lesson, just to give you the context of this API gateway, because it may seem like a software engineering concept, but in reality, it's also used in our data engineering lives for the direct real-time data ingestion. So thanks for watching and see you in the next lesson.